Let's see how much fiberglass cloth I'm going to need here. 44 inches. The pieces that go up to the edges here, I'm cutting. So you can see I made a cut there so I can fold these up. I've made several cuts here so this guy can wrap around and this guy can go down and that guy can wrap around. Then up here I've cut around and over here so that this side can go around that thing. This side can go around this thing. And the back is just flat and the bottom is just flat. I cut the corners of that side in the same way so that this fiberglass cloth will go up and it will join the seat and the back to the sidewalls on both sides. Put a couple clamps on the top so it's not going to move around while I put this last, super flat. It's just a flat roll of the fiberglass cloth in the middle there. Because I have these corners cut very precisely and where they need to be, I'm going to leave these clamps at the top so that this big piece will stay where it's supposed to be. I'm going to lift the bottom part up and over. That will let me paint epoxy on the bottom bench seat and this sidewall. I'm going to lay it back down, put that in there, and then after I get the bottom part anchored nicely, then I'll take the clamps off, flow this over, paint epoxy on the big surfaces, and push it back over the top. That way I'm hoping to keep all these corners lined up nicely. Okay, that did not go to plan. Probably one of the worst epoxy disasters since the time I spilled the whole mixing pot. Biggest issue here is I am using the medium hardener. It's worked pretty well for most of the stuff I've been doing, but I learned on the slow hardener. So when I learned that, hey, I can paint the back of this thing and then put that thing up there and smooth it out, that's fine if it's a slow hardener and it's not getting tacky really fast, but when it was getting tacky I just had a hard time getting that thing up there. So I had to call in an extra set of hands just to get it in a somewhat okay state. And it never really worked, so what I had to do is I had to cut it in two pieces so I could lay the bottom piece, get it fully flat, then lay the top piece and get that fully flat. So over here I just cut it off. I was out of work in time, so I have only the bottom done here. Biggest issue here is I set the mixing pot down on my work surface, and normally with slow hardener or medium hardener, if you have a thin layer of epoxy iron foam, it doesn't get hot enough to melt it. But if you have a large amount in your mixing pot, it'll kick and get hot real fast, melting my foam. So I have another day of glass bead epoxy filler work to do here to get my seat back to a somewhat flat level before I can even think about doing this centerpiece. So, moral of the story, don't mix the big pots because they kick too fast. Mix a lot of small pots. Don't try to do the whole piece at once. Do the bottom piece first, then the top piece, and so forth. Even here, where there's not a lot of corners and edges, I could maybe get away if I had another pair of hands where they could roll it out flat as I went down, but I'm not going to. I'm just going to cut it in half. I'm going to do a couple inches up the back and around the front, and then a couple inches down here and up and over the top. I should point out this is a physical melting process, not a chemical process, so the epoxy resin itself doesn't chemically melt the foam. It's simply heat that melts it. I've got one layer of fiberglass cloth down over that whole part there so I can actually sit on my seat without protecting the foam with anything else. Alright, looks like I got the measurements on the seat just about right. My leveling compound has dried. You can see here a piece of foam is lighter than the leveling compound, so it floated up. So I'm going to sand this thing down, and while I'm here sanding, I might as well sand this whole area I have fiberglass cloth on, and that fiberglass cloth down there, so I can adhere other stuff to it the next time I put a layer down. I took the piece of fiberglass that I cut off of there and I put it over here. I've cut it to be the bottom because the bottom is smaller. I'm going to use that tomorrow. So here I cut a new piece that overlaps that corner. I'm going to put that in. I took this big piece and I cut it so that there's a 2-inch overlap there, a little bit less hanging off here and hanging off the back. I'm going to be putting that in 2 pieces. So after I get done with these 3 pieces of fiberglass cloth, I will have 1 layer of fiberglass cloth over the entire seat. And then I'll sand this bit and then do a whole nother layer tomorrow. You can see here where I have the leveling compound filling in that melted piece of foam. It'll be a lot easier to see after I put resin on top of that cloth. So now I'm going to start in with the 60 grit sandpaper and knock down all the high spots. And that'll also get it ready for the second layer to stick to it. This section of the back bench seat is exactly how I want the entire thing to look. It's basically perfectly flat. You got a little bit of weave pattern, but you can cover that up with some epoxy. And then I have places where we have joins underneath, join on top. I've sanded it down a lot so it's pretty darn smooth, but you can still see where the joins are, where these layers overlap. And then you have things like these strings, where a string of fiberglass cloth kind of detached from the rest of it and kind of flopped around. It draws epoxy up, and so it makes some more epoxy, and I sanded it down so it's pretty flat. Once I put epoxy over the weave, this will mostly flow together. And then you have things like the drips here, where you can see where epoxy was slowly dripping down. So I've sanded it all mostly flat, but there is still some artifacts there, and there is a little bit of texture on the surface still. But I'm tired of sanding, so I'm going to quit now. You can see I have high standards for myself. There's that patch hole, which is a little bit wavy, but mostly smooth. And now I'm going to cut out and lay up another layer of epoxy cloth. Probably be 6 pieces. I'm going to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And on the back here, I'm going to cut them longer, so instead of hanging over just a couple of inches, I'm going to hang them over almost a foot and kind of smooth this transition in. Here is the 3 pieces of cloth for the bottom. You'll notice I have them cut at the corners so they wrap around, and this type of thing will wrap around here. Now I just have to take those 3, roll them up, put them someplace that's the bottom place, and do 3 for the back. That's one of the back pieces. I have it cut in the corner so it'll go folding around the corner there. I've cut a section out here and notched it so this stuff will fold around. And although it's unnecessary to make this thing flow around, I've notched right here at the edge. That way when I'm laying this whole thing out, I'm going to roll it down from the top. I'll know exactly where to line that thing up and where to line this thing up so that it'll go down in the same general angle and drape. I have this all ready for tomorrow morning with my 3 pieces for the bench seat bottom and 3 pieces for the bench seat back. I can come in tomorrow morning, do one big long layup, and at that point the fiberglass on the bench seat will be done, with the exception of any doors and drawers I'm going to be building in here. I'll still have a lot of epoxy and sanding work to do to smooth it out a bit, and then of course I'll have to paint it. So that job was a little bit too much surface area for the medium hardener. It worked okay, but I was a little time pressured. I had to switch buckets. I had, you know, that bucket went to this bucket, had to do the last little batch in that bucket because I was getting polymers stuck in my buckets. So for something like this, the slow hardener makes it a lot easier. You can just use one bucket. The epoxy is still a little bit damp in the first place you started. When you're finishing the last place, you can wipe everything across and make it nice and even. Now, if you're trying to get things done fast, the medium hardener is the way to go for something like this, because you're working fast, this thing's going to dry fast. A couple hours, you could do some more stuff with it. But for ease of use and less stress, I think I'm going to be buying slow hardener from here in the future. Now, the medium hardener is fine for small pieces. You know, if I was doing like just the bottom all at once, and then the next day doing just the top, it would have been just fine. But you know, this is about the surface area where you might want to be thinking about switching from medium to low to the slow hardener. So with the exception of a drawer, two doors, and maybe just a little bit of fiberglass on the inside back of that bench, this thing is basically as done as it's going to be. So I'm going to see how much it weighs right now. Alright, that is 66 pounds. I need to do a little bit of surface preparation, which will involve sanding and putting some epoxy, brushing some epoxy on top to smooth things out. But essentially, this guy is done from a fiberglass cloth standpoint. I just weighed it, the whole thing weighs 66 pounds right now. I'm going to obviously have to trim off the fiberglass hanging down there. You can see here I have tried to make my overlaps not overlap themselves, so you know there's a seam there and a seam there underneath and a seam here and there's kind of a seam there. There's a few places where I'm going to have to sand down these fibers that stick off the end of things, and then in the back there's a few places like here. There's a couple of lumps which are combinations of drips and bumps in some of the fiberglass here. The overall back is pretty good. I still have some places like that need sanding down, and you know, all of this stuff here where individual fibers or drips went down. I have like, there's a pretty good drip right there. A lot of this back I'm going to sand, you know, around the top right now, but a lot of the back I'm going to be sanding after I put it up on sawhorses and put this place up. But you know, things like this I definitely want to sand down. So my goal for today is to get this entire bench as smooth as I think I can. Maybe I'll just run out of steam and quit for the day at some point. And then put epoxy, just brush epoxy over the whole thing to smooth it out after I sand it. If I'm not happy with how far the sanding has gone, I might just sand another day after this before I put epoxy on. I just spent about 50 minutes sanding this guy down. Gone through about 6 sheets of 60 grit sandpaper. Made some progress. So the seam that used to be there is less visible. You don't have a line on it at least. And this seam here is also mostly knocked down. You can still see that line right there just a little bit. The horizontal seam just wasn't as bad to begin with, I think. It's about knocked down as much as those two vertical seams. I still have some vertical seams like on the side here where I haven't really worked on it yet. And you can see all the drips there that have been kind of knocked mostly flat, although the fact that you can see them means they're not marked completely flat. I have some more drips over here that have been, again, mostly knocked flat. The back I haven't worked on as much. I got the big pieces knocked down, especially near the corner here. Once I flip this horizontally, I'll be able to sand the whole thing and paint some epoxy over the whole thing. So I'm really only worried about this right near the edge because I don't want to paint your epoxy near the edge and have it drip down while it's horizontal. And then on this side I have lots of junk there to work on too. So by my estimation, it's going to take at least another hour of sanding to get the bench part to a place where I want to be putting more epoxy on it. So I'm going to quit for the day, come back tomorrow. Sanding today is going much better than yesterday. I have new sandpaper. This is 3M Sandblaster Pro Longer Lasting. No slip grip durable backing. I recommend this. So this, I've had this on here sanding for 25 minutes or so, and the edges are loaded up where I've been hitting, the edges of fiberglass, but the center's not really fully loaded up. And it's time for me to change it, but I was going through one of these sheets every probably 6 minutes or 8 minutes 2 days ago when I was sanding. So I'm not sure if this is really, what I paid for it better be damn good sandpaper. The other sandpaper I was using 2 days ago was loading up really bad and not doing a great job. It might be that 24 hours of drying time isn't enough, even with the medium hardener, and my fiberglass or epoxy resin hadn't fully hardened, and so was loading up the sandpaper because of that. Might be just my sandpaper was crappy. But this sandpaper, especially after 72 hours after I put the fiberglass down, it's doing a great job. I'm very happy with this. Yes, I definitely recommend the 3M brand Last Longer sanding paper. So I'm not done yet. I've only done another 30-some minutes, but I only went through 2 of those little sheets of sandpaper, and you can see that most of the edges have been knocked down. There's still a few places with shiny spots here and there, and you can see this little shiny line there. Some of that will be fixed when I paint epoxy resin over the entire surface and then start sanding that again. So anything that's super low is going to be fixed by that. I still have areas like these drips here, which are mostly flat, but there's still some texture there. So I need to come back and probably do another 30 to 40 minutes of sanding. Not so much in seams and particular areas, but just overall in the whole thing before I paint epoxy on it and then come back and sand some more.